Why do we go buy stuff, make things, get paychecks, do all these things? What's the purpose of it? Over the last 2 days, we've heard about the incredible inequality that we're seeing both in this country and globally. Is it so that those 3 men who have half the wealth of the nation, is that what the economy is for? What would you say? No. Okay, I was hoping. In this crowd, you should say no.
But none of those 3 guys were here.
No. Or funded this.
Right, okay.
So what I would say is, what if we were to question the normative framework by which we judge the economy? What is that? And what the work I've been doing with my colleagues is to say, what if we said that the fulfillment of human rights is the purpose of the economy? Then we judge economic policy by looking at how it fulfills human rights. It's not a complicated thing. It's actually quite simple. You look at the substantive freedoms that people have, equality, when you talk about gender equality, and in terms of realized outcomes. Are people eating? We talked about housing. We talked about mass incarceration. We talked about poverty. Now, if we were to judge economic policy by the fact that it does not fulfill these rights, then we can think about a different kind of economy. And what's interesting to me about the human rights framework and why I came to it was that it's based on international law, right? We've talked about capitalism, socialism. We can debate about that for a long time, but international human rights law actually gives a framework by which we judge the economy. We could look at fiscal policy, monetary policy, international trade. I would be remiss to say that, you know, López Obrador is being inaugurated today in Mexico. And I was just there, yes, some victories. I was just there in October working with the National Human Rights Commission to really set up a guidepost by which we could think about economic policy in Mexico based on human rights. And just one small example of that, because I know we each have 3 minutes. You know, when NAFTA was signed, the Mexican Constitution had to be altered so many times to accommodate the NAFTA policies, including things like communal land ownership, inheritance, all of this to accommodate NAFTA. Nobody stood up and said, how can you change the Constitution when there's an international trade agreement? So if human rights was the evaluative mechanism by which we looked at economic policy making, those questions would have been answered. And the last thing is that one of the things human rights really does is the non-discrimination and equality. And so as a feminist economist, it's very critical that we look at issues of race and gender and intersectionality when we look at economic policy making.
Tulsi, I mentioned a bit of the connectedness between environmental policy and broader human dignity and human rights. You focused on environmental concerns and environmental justice as a human right, as promoting human dignity. You want to speak about that a bit?
Yes, this is something that is too often overlooked, that the fact is the most basic and fundamental human right is clean air and clean water. When you think about it, and maybe we can all just stop and just try to hold your breath. See how long you can hold your breath for. Can't hold your breath for very long. You can't exist for very long without air. You can't exist for very long without clean water. However, so many of the decisions that are being made with regards to policy, many of the decisions that are being made by big corporations, the decisions that are being made by those driven by greed rather than driven by putting the interests and the livability of the people first, don't take this into account. And there are example after example after example that we can go through just here in our country alone, what to speak of in other parts of the world, that illustrate this. When I was, I think it was, I don't know, 16 or 17 years old growing up in Hawaii, there was a big developer that wanted to build a landfill over one of our largest water aquifers on the island of Oahu. He was hooked up with the politicians. Things were rolling along as they expected they would. They were starting to get the approvals until leaders within the community stood up and said, no, we will not allow you to put at risk our ability to live, put at risk our future. To consider putting a landfill over this water aquifer would essentially mean that the people of Hawaii would then be forced to have to rely on shipping bottled water in from the mainland if that contamination occurred, which was more likely than not. And so thankfully, and this is one of the first things I got to do, is passing out petitions and activating the community to take a stand and say, no, we're not going to let you contaminate our water. Going and spending time with water protectors at Standing Rock, same situation. You have a big fossil fuel company coming in, not taking into account what the impact and what the risk is for the people there. What to speak of the larger impact that the fossil fuel industry has on our air. Another example from Hawaii, there's on Maui, for example, we had a large plantation owner that decades ago started diverting water from the top of the mountains away from their natural flow, where you had Native Hawaiian farmers who for generations have been growing food, passing those native practices down to their children, their children's children, diverting those streams so that the water went directly to their big plantation. Ending that native practice for those families that they called kuleana farmers, and completely drying up those streams. And this is a fight that continues to go on today. There's been some success in putting those streams back to their natural flow so these kuleana farmers can continue to farm and grow food for their families and their community. But these are just some examples of how, without foresight, without leaders who actually understand what these fundamental rights are and how critical they are and what the impacts are, not just for our generation, but for generations to come, then we end up in the situation that we are in, where we have thousands of people in our country who are being poisoned by water, places like Flint, Michigan, because of a lack of investment in the right kind of infrastructure, and impacts that will continue to occur for generations unless we take action now.
Thank you. Susan, you've become quite an advocate for refugees and for people who are forced to migrate from their homelands, spent time in the Isle of Lesbos, and have recently done a film about refugees in Lebanon, an economic project that they've started there and that you've been helpful with. We often overlook this refugee migrant issue as one that is cross-cutting, that comes from war, conflict, from economic deprivation, et cetera. What have you learned from the time you've been spending with refugees about what we ignore about this issue?
Well, I think the thing that really, this constant flow in Lesbos because I've been to a lot of disaster areas where you knew what needed to be accomplished. There were this many dead, there were this many injured, you had to build. But in Lesbos, it was just a stream, an unending stream of desperation that just got even worse once they got to the camps. And that, I'd never seen anything like that. And all I did, what I was there to do was to learn who they were, because at this time, which was a few years ago, the press, you know, was just vilifying them and reducing them to this concept, which I consider an act of violence once you dehumanize people. And so I just asked them where they were from, why they left, what they hoped to do, where they were going, and tried to get that. The having to post helped me. I posted every day. I took pictures. I mean, I was just there by myself. I wasn't part of a group. And home means so much to me, and kids mean so much to me. So that was really heartbreaking. But it made me think about what we're doing, that or what can be done to raise people who respect the dignity of everyone, who agreed, you know, when you're raising kids, this idea of success is somehow folded into also their safety. Like, you know, if they get this kind of a job, then they'll survive and they'll be able to have an apartment and they'll be able to be happy. So God forbid they be gay or be an artist or anything that's going to get in the way of something that's more practical or safe, you know. And you find yourself, and really what we should be doing is just raising people who are connected to the earth. I mean, we've lost that, who you know, want to protect the earth because they are part of the earth, not just because they're terrified. We want to raise kids who reach out to other people because they're not terrified of the other, whether that means that you travel them or how they get out of their bubble to be able to understand that everyone deserves dignity. And it's always isolation and fear that makes people behave badly. And so I really started thinking, how can we have such a lack of empathy? And when it goes all the way up to the government level, I mean, that's when you really get in trouble, because then decisions are being made that have nothing to do with people, that have to do with profit, that have to do with whoever the lobbyist. I mean, I'm speaking to the choir here because I'm sure everyone here knows that. But how do we change that? How do we start to elect people who have priorities that are different than the ones that have been running this country for a very long time, and create these situations, because it is environmental, because it is war, because it's not just a natural, organic problem. And now we've gotten to the point where it's either make or break. So things are really interesting, right? If you could kind of glide along for a while, that's no longer possible. There's no middle ground. You're either with us or against us. And I think we were talking earlier about the Green New Deal. Whatever we can do to create those boxes that have to be checked off as you choose your candidate to run is very, very important. And that's how, you know, the playing field will at least will start to get people who are a little bit more, hopefully, immune to the corruption that seems to get a hold of everybody at a certain point.
Thank you. Ben, it's a perfect segue. You're
okay, Jim.
No, look. It was a heartbreaking loss.
Yeah.
For people of Maryland. I've got 8 grandkids in Maryland, and you were you were the candidate that I trusted to provide for their future, and all of these issues come down to that level, and even below that to urban, to who runs our cities. But talk about the role of state government in addressing all of these issues, what's possible, what's not possible, and what you see for the future.
Well, first I would flip that. I would say rather than come down to that level, they rise up from that level. We live at that level. We live at the level of the street in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our counties, in our cities, in our states. But before I get started, 2 things. 1, good morning. Thank you for getting out. And then 2, I want to say thank you. And you always get in trouble when you say thank you in a room full of wonderful people. But I want to say thank you to Jane for just convening all of us. It's been tremendous. And we're talking on a panel about civil rights, and there's a lot of folks in this room who've done a lot of good things, but I just want to take a moment to recognize a few, because I have this incredible view from here. One is my good friend Cornel West, who's in the back. Good to see you, brother. Ms. Goodman, Amy Goodman and I stood there. I'll never forget, I was in Georgia, and Troy Davis was being executed. And my old church in Harlem was watching Democracy Now! Everybody gathered together. And Amy and I were there in that field. And you know, what she does for all of us to just inject a little morality into the news, I'm deeply, deeply grateful for. In this front row, there's 2 folks. One, I think maybe we're starting to get to know better in this room. One is Gus Newport, who a long time ago inspired boys like me, I was a boy then, to believe that you could run and it didn't matter what color you were. And thank you for that. But here in the middle of the row, quietly, is Bob Moses. We were actually mentored by the same doctor down in Mississippi, a guy named James Anderson. Took care of both of us as organizers. But I just wanted all of us just to thank Bob for what he did for our country. You know, when your family's like mine and Bob's, your family's ultimately, rooted in the experience of segregation in this country, in my case in the South. And my grandma turned 102 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
Her granddad was born a slave. He became a state legislator. He co-founded Virginia State University. And my whole life, we were taught that the states' rights movement was the problem, that Democrats could fix the country if it wasn't but for these Republicans who basically had this ongoing rebellion at the state level to keep us from fixing things from the top down. And then one day you wake up and the far right wing controls every branch of the federal government. And you say to yourself, how did we get here? We got there with the right wing and their states' rights movement. You prioritize organizing from the bottom up. You prioritize controlling states. Well, eventually you control Congress because you control redistricting. You're building a bench to run for all kinds of offices across the state. Well, then you have an incredible bench to run for the federal government. And so in this moment, I would encourage us not to despair because we don't control our federal government. It's great that we've taken back the House, and I want to thank everybody who's a part of that. But we all know until you have the Senate and the presidency, you can't get a whole lot done. And we have to get a whole lot done. And I would say we have no choice but to make our cities, as Bernie did here, our counties, our states models for the rest of our country. Listening to the panel, Radhika talking about the need to put human needs at the center of our economics and not human greed. Dr. King was talking about that at the end of his life. There's a great video, you can find it online, where it took him a year, I think, or so of his assassination. And he said, I was a bit naive. Everything we demanded didn't cost that much. And now we're getting to this place as he was leading the Poor People's Campaign, where we've got to talk about some things that cost something. Now here's the reality, you dig into it and what we're actually talking about is saving money. Because Medicare for all will save us money. Because you end mass incarceration, it turns out you have enough money to lower the cost of public higher education dramatically. But we can't be afraid to dig into those issues, and we cannot give ourselves permission to disengage because we can't control the federal government right now. You talk about clean air, clean water, that's what we really need the leadership. The EPA should be like the fail-safe, the last resort. The leadership has to come at the state level, the local level. And on the issue of immigration, first of all, the connection's always been there for the civil rights community. If you go back, if you know your history, right after we passed the Civil Rights Act, the next thing we do is we end Europe only, the Europe only preference for migration to this country. And so it's always been one movement, one human rights movement, one civil rights movement. But there is a lot, our states have to have the courage of our common sense. This whole, I was beat up during the campaign, this whole talk about, sanctuary states, sanctuary cities, da-da-da-da-da. Well, where'd that start? Same place, it's like affirmative action. It's like the EPA. Who signed the affirmative action into law at the federal level? Richard Nixon. Who signed the EPA into existence? Richard Nixon. The Republicans are usually for something before they're against something. And on this issue of sanctuary cities, where did that start? Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates of Rodney King infamy, like a broken clock, was right once. INS, we now call ICE, approached him and they said, we would be honored if you would be deputies of immigration, LAPD. Daryl Gates said, thank you, I'm honored by your request, but no. I said, why not? He said, because we have one job, and that's to keep the people safe, not some of them, all of them. And the day where your deputies, people become less safe, they said, how? So first we become distracted because we have one job now, we'll have two jobs then. But then the immigrants will stop talking to us. Not just the ones who don't have papers, like most of them will stop talking to us. And we'll have less information, so we'll solve fewer crimes. And then, knowing that they're not talking to us, wealthy criminal networks will become even more enriched as they target those communities, knowing that they don't talk to us. So thank you, but no, because we have one job, which is to keep the people safe. And I would remind us that, and it was one of the kind of the core issues in the Republicans went back, and Dave Chappelle came into my state and he said, wow, brother, listen, they colored you with a brown crayon and renamed you Willie Horton. They don't have many playbooks. They call us socialists, and they say that we love criminals and want to make everybody less safe. It doesn't make any sense. But one of the things that allows them to get away with that is I think we don't own the fact that our policies, yes, they're the right thing to do from a human rights perspective. They're also the right thing to do from an economic perspective. They're the right thing to do from a public safety perspective. And we've got to be willing to actually stop for a moment and say, wait a second, Medicare for all will save us money. Insisting that our police only have one job will make us safer. At the end of the day, we root this movement in our cities, in our counties, in our states. And while the work will feel harder in some ways, and we'll be focused to give our $5 or our $27 to more candidates and more places, and be organizing all the time and not just for the federal cycles, what we'll find is that we move further, faster, and that our hope increases. We have to get back to winning. And the most powerful way to do that is to set our sights at every level of government and understand that it's not that change comes from the top down. Change has always come from the bottom up.
Thank you, Ben. You raised a number of issues that I want to sort of parse out with others on the panel. First, this question of migration and the number of people who've been coming. One of the things that has intrigued me is the extent to which there was a book by Jacob Bronowski, a brilliant philosopher of science, who writes a book about truth and science, and the book opens as he's flying into Hiroshima to investigate. He's part of the team that went in from the U.S. to investigate the impact of it. And he's flying in and he sees this devastated city. And just at that moment, on the plane, the music is playing with a loudspeaker. And it was a song that was popular in the 40s called Is You Is or Is You Ain't My Baby. And it hits him. And he says, paternity. He said, we own this. We did this. And even before we did this, that area of Hiroshima was an industrial slum brought on by the Industrial Revolution. We did that too. And so the whole book is about paternity. It's about ownership. And when I see the French bellyaching about people coming from former French colonies into France, or the Brits complaining about people coming from former British colonies to Britain, or I hear America today bellyaching about migrants coming from Central America, and duh, I mean, what did we do to colonize, despite the fact that we don't call ourselves an imperial power? We devastated the economies and exploited the hell out of Honduras, Guatemala, Salvador, etc., and distorted their governance systems. And we got them. There are chickens coming home to roost. We don't ever talk about that connection, do we?
No, I mean, I think the first thing to remember, especially if we're talking about the United States, is that it's a settler colonial state. And if we don't start at that point, then we forget the history of how this state was established. It was also a country based on enslaving people, and it was the colonizers who came here. I was just recently at the African American Museum in D.C., and really a pilgrimage that everyone should go to in terms of the history of this country. So I think your point in terms of immigration and the complicity of the U.S. fight, the Cold War fight, was part of this immigration. And if you look, for example, I keep going back to Mexico because I've been doing some work there. If we look at the extent of immigration from Mexico to the United States, there's a huge uptick after NAFTA. And that was when our products were being sold for really cheap because of all kinds of trade agreements that I won't get into right now. But but those relationships between the kind of economic policies, I'm focusing on economic, but they're political ones, and immigration is an important one. I'm an immigrant to this country, and when my father came here, it's because the U.S. needed civil engineers, and they went to India and said, will you come here because you're a civil engineer, and handed him a green card to come here. And so now, what is it that we need? I mean, we need to talk about sort of those economic considerations. I want to go back just for a minute to the work on human rights and economic policy, not necessarily connected to immigration, but I think yesterday, I think it was Naomi Klein who's talked about we need a new social contract. And what is the role of the state? What is the role of the local state? What is the role of the federal state? And one of the things that the human rights framework gives us is that the state's obligation is to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. Now, if we held them to that standard, issues of immigration, my favorite one in terms of protect is the removal of the Glass-Steagall Act. That was a human rights violation for the obligation to protect. And the obligation to protect is the government's role is to protect people against third-party interests. Now, if there wasn't a third-party interest in terms of the role of finance, that was it. And so I think going back and holding the governments accountable for their obligations that are in international law gives us an enormous place to kind of campaign in ways that isn't that divisive in terms of am I this or am I that. It's just like this is your role and this is what you're supposed to do. And the last thing I want to say is that I think one of the most powerful aspects of the human rights system is that it's supposed to be transparent, participatory, and economic policy making is neither. It is neither transparent or participatory. And if we say that that has to be a criterion of economic policy making, it means that we need to make sure that people understand economic policy, right? Most people don't. They think technocrats, economists, like many of us here, are supposed to know something that they don't. But what we need to do is really translate it so that they can actually hold the government and their people to account for what it is that they're saying, right? And so I think one other thing that we need to do is to really democratize economic policy making.
Tulsi, your general comments on that, but I was noting when you were speaking about the small farmers versus the plantations, and a century or so ago, the United States, we had our own interaction, I guess would be a nice word to put it, in Hawaii. Yes. A transformative interaction. Talk about that and the sense just about how we just wipe it out of history. Mm-hmm. It's like not there. It didn't happen. Yeah. It's like, history began the day I got the job, not like what happened a century ago. Yeah. The lasting impact of that.
That's such a big topic, and I'm thinking about what happened in 2 minutes or less.
Thank you.
The overthrow of the monarchy in Hawaii. Yeah. What really drove that? When you're talking about what happened in Guatemala, what really drove that? You're talking about the United Fruit Company and the corporate interests that drove United States intervention there that completely screwed things up now for generations. And you can draw that exact same line to Hawaii and the corporate interests that were behind influencing the United States government to come in and bring in the US military, ultimately, to overthrow the Queen. And how deeply that has impacted the Native Hawaiian community in Hawaii, the Native Hawaiian people who are more and more now throughout my life are standing up to protect Native Hawaiian language, culture, and practices, many things that had really been suppressed for a very long time. There are so many examples that we can point to your original issue that you raised, Jim, that we have to remember history. We have to be truthful about what happened and why, and what drove those actions, and then look forward to how can we correct them. So taking again, Guatemala, Central America, the challenges that people are facing in those countries that are driving them to leave, to seek refuge, rather than simply reacting to the moment, we should be challenging ourselves to see how can we actually help provide assistance, provide aid, invest in empowering people so that they're not being driven from their homes, so that they can actually look forward to keeping their families in the place where they have lived for generations and being successful, being peaceful, being prosperous. And to your point, Radhika, I think it's so important for us to look at this economic empowerment based on human rights and needs, not consumerism and greed.
Yeah.
That's such an important distinction and difference to make. And that is the approach that we need to look at as we look at economic opportunity. Yes, for us here at home, but as we look at the needs of people in other places, especially places where we have intervened.
Ben, you want to come in? Then Susan, I have a question for you.
Yeah, just, you know, I think it's important that we democratize our image of us, who we are. You know, we talk about colonialism, talk about the way this country was built in other Western nations, and we often forget the obvious. We'll talk about the original sins of America, slavery and Native American genocide, and eventually we'll get around to Chinese railroad workers, Japanese internment. Forget about indentured servitude. Forget about the Georgia penal colony. And it's important that we don't. Because when you do that, you forget about what's going on right here. You know, I was giving a speech towards the end of my campaign, and the first time I've talked publicly since that campaign, but it's been less than a month. And I was talking about government contracting in Maryland, how women are 53% of the state, and people of color are 48.5% of the state, and the state's lofty goal is that 75% of the population gets 29% of the contracts. That's the goal. And I would say, you know, maybe it's just the white guy and this black guy. You know, my dad's white, my uncles are white. I want white guys to do well. If you went to my uncles and you said, you know, if you ever get, you're all 25% of the population, you ever get 9% of the contracts, you should throw a party. You'd hear a lot from them, and none of it would be good. But then it hit me in the last speech. I said, but that exclusion based on gender, exclusion based on race is only the most obvious exclusion, the visually undeniable exclusion. Because I can take you to zip codes in Western Maryland or South Baltimore where white men are excluded systematically because of where they were born and who their parents weren't. A little white girl, not 10 years old, when I say I can take you to white men who are locked out, pipes up, that's right! Men who were veterans, who were serving overseas when other people were here, creating old school ties, joining country clubs that these guys will never belong to. And really, when you get down to it, it's more, not 75% of Maryland that's locked in a government contract opportunity, it's like 95 to 98% of the state. And when you look at it that way, when you start and you include indentured servitude in the original, then it's not a surprise that we don't just have the most incarcerated black and brown people on the planet, but we also have the most incarcerated white people on the planet. Then you remember that in our litany of who's had to fight for their voting rights, it's not just blacks and women and other groups of color. It's also white men who didn't own land. the privates in the Revolutionary Army were denied the right to vote. And then when you insert, which is essentially class, back into a conversation about race and gender, then you have a much broader picture of who it is that we're organizing. This kind of last thing is this. The greatest moments of Bernie's campaign for me, we were in the Ozarks. And I was getting nervous because we were about half an hour into the speech, and, you know, it's the same speech. It's a long speech. It's like the free bird of politics. Right? And everybody knows the line. They're going to yell it out, and if they're not sober, maybe not at the right time. Right? And so I think Tulsi and I were actually there together that day. And so he was approaching the place where he was going to call for the police to stop killing unarmed black women, unarmed black men. And I was getting anxious because I had just come from Detroit and Chicago. And if the response was any more tepid to that call than it had been in those cities, I was going to be off in a way that you just don't want to be off. I'm down for your people. I need you to be down for my people. And Bernie puts out the call. And the response is overwhelming. You look out through the curtain, and half the guys in deer hunting camouflage you can see were standing on their chairs with their fists in the air hollering. And I was like, well, what just happened? Well, first of all, the obvious, Bo and Luke Duke didn't like the cops either. But beyond what happens in places like the Ozarks and Appalachia as far as, police abuse, you just look at the opinion polls. He had spent half an hour talking about the concerns of poor white people in the Ozarks, making things in America again, making it easier to organize, making college affordable so you can dream your children might be better off, making it easier to own a home, making sure that education works well in every zip code. And then he explicitly asked him to be an ally to somebody else. And like every other group, we practice identity politics, right? The circle is like Pac-Man. We leave out working class white men. Everybody else is at least a civil rights concern. We like the things that don't cost very much. Like every other group, having addressed their concerns, those guys dressed in camouflage, deer hunting camouflage. He asked them to be an ally to somebody else, and they were ready to be an ally to somebody else. And so as we democratize things, let's democratize our image of us. Because there's been a big us for a very long time. It's actually like 95% of the country.
Yeah. I want to pull back for a minute, Susan, to the earlier thread of the conversation. And something you said struck me. I remember when it initially became clear to us the magnitude of the migration crisis, I helped convene, I was on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. We convened a gathering of all of the refugee groups. And the man from Hias said something I never forgot. He said, to speak to that mother and have her tell you the story of how she took everything, every risk into her hands to carry her children for miles for safety. He said, you'll never look at refugees again. You heard stories on Lesbos. Talk to us a little about that, because we look at them as a mass. Yeah. We see these people at the border coming in as a mass, but we never see them as real people with real stories who take enormous risks, and every one of them matter. Talk to us about that a bit.
Boats arriving with very, very pregnant women, with children, boats going under. We would have an app. There's an app that someone tells you when the boats are coming in. And so you get up very, very early. Only a few people have the app, and it's passed around. And because some of the money isn't paid until that refugee in Turkey, until that refugee calls in and says that they're in, and then they release the money. So we would meet them, and it was cold. It was before Christmas. 5-day-old babies, just with 15-year-old mothers, just so disturbing, so heartbreaking. And finally, one mother just said to me, just imagine that you're on the 10th floor of a building and it's on fire. You know if you stay, you'll die. If you jump, there's a chance you'll survive. That's why we're on the boats, because what you think, why would you take this chance? Mm-hmm. How could you bring your family, people in wheelchairs? And I'm listening to, and men weeping. And then later on, I went to Berlin a year later. I brought ping pong tables to the refugee centers the permanent refugee centers. And by that time, the men were really going under. They're psychologically, because once the actual immediate threat was over, and the fact that they couldn't get a job, when I said, what do you need here at the center, which was so movingly manned by 90% volunteers who eventually just left their jobs and were there even the next year when I went back to see how the ping pong tables and the refugees were holding up. They were really going under. They'd managed to move some people into, and this is what's interesting, when they found these abandoned dormitories that had a communal kitchen, that made a huge difference when people could cook for themselves, because of course cooking and sharing meals and everything is such a huge part of it. But you really, in listening to everyone talking, the other thing that strikes me is how little history our kids have of any of this. And then, now we have this swell of millennials and younger that are going to vote for the first time also in 2020 and are awakened because of the environment, because of especially of shootings and all of that. And our education system is not giving them a context, is not giving them history, really, from a point of view that is relevant, anyway. And they just know that we've messed up. And now they're demanding answers, and they're demanding candidates, and they're not interested in who the parties as much as the issues, which is a good thing. They're not watching mainstream media as much as they're getting their information from other sources. And I think and I wonder how we can give them the approval to care about these things as opposed to making money. How we can connect them with passion for something as opposed to going into a job that is safe. How can we encourage them to take pride in these other values when we define success? I mean, I showed up, I have a friend who is a multimillionaire, and he's a libertarian, and we're always arguing about things because I just can't give up. And I send him articles, and he explains to me why the $15 minimum wage doesn't really work, and I send him stuff, and then he sends me back stuff and everything. And I sent him a list of CEOs and how this exorbitant amount of money that they'd made and severance, just this obscene thing. And his response was, good businessmen. So how do we shift? We have to make sure we're shifting in our kids in what they're pursuing, some sense of happiness and an accomplishment of values other than just making the deal, which this president is all about, instead of just making the deal. And a lot of that has to do with valuing conversations, with valuing curiosity, with valuing outreach. It's, the United States is so big that the kids here, it's not like in Europe where you can travel to all different countries. Here, going to California, you would have already gone through how many countries if you were in Europe? So they're very isolated, our kids. And I remember Harry Belafonte did a great thing where he took warring gang members to Africa. and they saw Africans and how they were living, and these two groups that were at each other's throats all the time. Something very special happened with that trip. So I guess I'm just rambling, but when I hear all of this, and in this room everybody's pretty sophisticated and concerned, or you wouldn't be here, you're engaged. The people that are coming up that are young are looking to be engaged, and I just pray that we can help them be engaged in a way that's going to last and serve the times that they're in and give them hope.
Thank you, Susan. Listen, that was a perfect way to sort of tie this all together, because there is here in this room and in this gathering a new consciousness that's developing. And I want to thank you, Jane, and thank you, David, and I also want to thank Colleen and Nikki, and I served on the board here for a bit, about a year or so, and I've graduated now to a fellow with you guys. But I think Meredith Barak is here, and Sarah Burkhart. They also served on the board. This has been an amazing experience, and the thing that tied me most to this, and still does, and comes through in this, is the notion of civil discourse. We can talk big ideas, and we can do it with civility, and we can learn from each other. It indicates a level of respect that we have for each other and even for our opponents, and that came through yesterday as well. I want you to, if you take nothing else with you from this weekend, progressive ideas can be talked about with civil discourse, and that's the way we learn. One final thing I have to say. Something happened 2 days ago that I really can't let go without talking about. Mark Lamont Hill was fired from CNN. He was fired from CNN for a speech he gave at the UN where he talked about equal rights and human rights for everybody from the river to the sea. People who didn't want to hear that tried to make it into something it wasn't. And Mark Lamont Hill paid a price. Not only did he pay a price, but civil discourse pays a price. And the ability to talk about complicated issues pays a price. If we can't talk about Israel-Palestine, if we can't talk about Syria, if we can't talk about, because you've paid a price for that, if we can't talk about race, if we can't talk about immigration policy without jumping on people who disagree and trying to make something out of it that it's not, and criminalize or weaponize our intolerance, then we all pay a price as a country. And that's where we are right now. Donald Trump demeans, tries to humiliate, and tries to silence people who think differently. That's not the way forward. What we're doing in the gathering is the way forward, because we find a way to actually talk about complex ideas and do it in a respectful way. My community's paid a big price for that. I just have to be very, very clear about it. We've been excluded from politics because we were the Arabs. One of the things I'll never forget Bernie for was meet the press one morning after having met with him and talked about issues. He said, they said, who advised you on foreign policy? And he said, Jim Zogby. And I said to my wife, holy shit. Holy shit. I said, I actually used that word. I said, and that's civil. Because I'd always been, pardon my expression, I'd always been the whore in the closet for people. I'd worked for different presidential candidates and stuff, but it was like, I don't know him. It's like, who's he? You know, whatever. It's like, give me the Arab money or give me the Arab votes, but don't talk to me about, you know, I'm not going to acknowledge you publicly. Bernie had the courage to not only acknowledge me publicly, but do me and J Street and others on both sides of the issue, and then ask me to serve on the platform drafting committee. And respect the fact that I had an ability to talk about Medicare for all, and to talk about my biggest victory was we won something, we suckered the Clinton people into it, ending the death penalty. Because we actually had the vote, Gus remembers it, we had the vote for it, and then they immediately called for a suspension of the vote after we were winning, because they wanted to bring their people out in caucus, because it was not Hillary's position. But what happened was, when they came back, I said to the chair, I said, well, it looks like they're back now. Have you whipped your people into line? And they were so embarrassed that they ended up saying, okay, you got it. But that sense of that Bernie was respectful of people with points of view that had not been brought together, that he tried to convene us as we're doing this weekend, convening people of diverse points of view from a progressive side that can elevate discourse, is really what this is all about. And I want to thank you, Jane, thank you, David, thank all of you for being here and including me and this remarkable panel that I've so enjoyed sitting and listening to. And thank you all very much. Do we have time for any questions? Because I have... Yes, no? No. No. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.